The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor. Tasha Johnson straightened her navy blazer and adjusted her folder of documents as she waited for her case to be called. At 34, the social worker had never been in any serious trouble before. Just a simple traffic violation that she planned to contest. Docket number 47,293, Johnson versus the state, called out the court clerk in a bored voice. Tasha rose from her seat, her heart beating a little faster as she approached the front of the courtroom. Judge William Harmon looked down at her from his high bench, his face already set in a frown. At 62, Harmon had been a fixture in the county courthouse for over 15 years. His reputation for being strict was well known, but what many didn't talk about openly were the whispers about his biased treatment of certain defendants. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Harmon said, drawing out her name in a way that made Tasha feel small. "You're contesting a ticket for running a red light. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Tasha replied clearly. "I have evidence that the light was yellow when I entered the intersection." Judge Harmon raised his eyebrows and leaned forward. "Evidence? Well, isn't that something?" His tone was mocking, and a few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tasha opened her folder and pulled out printed screenshots from the traffic camera footage she had requested through proper channels. "As you can see here, Your Honor, the timestamp shows." "I can see just fine, Ms. Johnson," Judge Harmon interrupted, not even glancing at the papers she held up. "What I'm having trouble understanding is why you people always think you can talk your way out of following the law." A hushed silence fell over the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers paused momentarily over her machine before continuing to type. In the back row, a man in a gray suit sat up straighter and began to take notes on a small pad. "Your Honor," Tasha began again, keeping her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I'm simply presenting the evidence as is my right." "Your right?" Judge Harmon scoffed. "Let me tell you about rights. I have the right to run my courtroom without having my time wasted. Maybe in your neighborhood, yellow means speed up and go through, but that's not how the law works." Tasha felt her cheeks burning, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, with all due respect, this has nothing to do with my neighborhood." The judge's face darkened. "Are you talking back to me, Ms. Johnson? Perhaps you don't understand how things work here. This isn't some community center meeting." The young law clerk at the side of the bench glanced nervously between the judge and Tasha. In the gallery, an older woman shook her head slightly, while the man in the gray suit continued writing, his expression serious. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," Tasha replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm simply trying to present my case." "Well, you're not doing a very good job of it," Judge Harmon sneered. "Maybe if you spoke proper English instead of that street talk, I could understand you better." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The court reporter looked up in shock. The bailiff, who had been standing near the wall, took a step forward, his face showing clear discomfort with the situation unfolding before him. The man in the gray suit closed his notebook and slipped out of the courtroom door, pulling his phone from his pocket as he went. Little did Judge Harmon know, but his career was about to come crashing down in less than 30 minutes. Tasha stood frozen at the podium, the judge's words hanging in the air like poison. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her folder, but she kept her head high. The tension in courtroom 302 was thick enough to touch. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. Could you please clarify what you mean by street talk?" Tasha asked with remarkable calm, given the circumstances. Judge Harmon's face reddened. He leaned forward, his robe stretching across his broad shoulders. "Don't play games with me, Ms. Johnson. You know exactly what I mean." The court reporter's fingers moved rapidly over her machine, capturing every word. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the direction the hearing was taking. "Actually, sir, I don't," Tasha replied. "I'm speaking to you professionally, as I would in my capacity as a social worker." "Social worker?" Judge Harmon scoffed loudly. "Well, that explains it. You people always think you know better than the officers who keep our streets safe." The bailiff, Officer Martinez, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. In his 15 years working in this courtroom, he had witnessed Judge Harmon's temper many times. But today was different. Today, the judge was crossing lines he had only hinted at before. In the back of the courtroom, the door opened quietly. The man in the gray suit returned, this time accompanied by a woman in a dark pantsuit who carried a small recording device in her hand. They sat in the last row, watching intently. "Your Honor," Tasha tried again, "I have documentation showing that the light was yellow when I entered the intersection. The officer who issued the ticket was positioned at an angle where he couldn't properly see the light change." Judge Harmon waved his hand dismissively. "Everyone from your part of town says the same thing. Next, you'll be telling me the officer targeted you because of your race." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. The young law clerk, Jason Turner, looked up from his notes with wide eyes. This was his first month working for Judge Harmon, and he had heard rumors about the judge's prejudices, but had never witnessed them so openly displayed. "I've made no such claim, Your Honor," Tasha said, her voice now tight with controlled anger. "I am simply presenting factual evidence about my case." "Factual? Ha!" Judge Harmon laughed coldly. "Let me tell you what's factual. The fact is, you ran a red light. The fact is, you're wasting this court's time. And the fact is, I'm about 2 seconds away from finding you in contempt if you keep up this attitude." Jason the clerk looked desperately toward Officer Martinez, who was now standing straighter, his hand hovering near his radio. Something was very wrong here, and everyone knew it. "What attitude would that be, specifically, Judge Harmon?" Tasha asked, emphasizing his title. The judge slammed his gavel down hard enough to make everyone jump. "That right there, that tone. You come into my courtroom with your fancy folder and your evidence, and you think you can talk to me like we're equals." The woman who had entered with the man in the gray suit was now openly recording the proceedings. She nodded to her companion, who silently got up and slipped out of the courtroom again. "I'm addressing you with respect, Your Honor," Tasha said, her voice steady despite the unfairness of it all. "Respect." Judge Harmon laughed again, a sound without humor. "You wouldn't know respect if it slapped you in the face. People like you never do." Officer Martinez took a step forward now, his face troubled. Outside in the hallway, there was the sound of rapid footsteps approaching. "People like me?" Tasha repeated, looking the judge directly in the eyes. "What exactly do you mean by that, Judge Harmon?" Little did any of them know, the answer to that question would seal the judge's fate. Judge Harmon's face twisted into an ugly sneer as he leaned forward over his bench. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look almost demonic. "You know exactly what I mean," he spat. "People from your neighborhood. People who think the law doesn't apply to them. People who," he paused, scanning Tasha from head to toe with open contempt. "People who look like you." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet whispers ceased. The court reporter's hands hovered over her machine, her face pale with shock. Tasha stood tall, her spine straight as steel despite the public humiliation. "Your Honor, I believe your comments are inappropriate and possibly violate judicial conduct codes." "Oh, do you now?" Judge Harmon's voice rose dangerously. "Let me tell you something about judicial conduct. I've been on this bench for 15 years. 15 years, and I've watched your kind come through here with excuse after excuse." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "perhaps we should take a brief recess." "Silence," the judge bellowed, slamming his gavel again. "I'm handling this case. Ms. Johnson wants to lecture me about traffic lights? Fine. Let's talk about how red lights apparently don't apply in certain parts of town." In the back of the courtroom, the woman in the dark pantsuit was recording everything, her expression grim as she documented each word. The young clerk Jason had gone completely white, his hand trembling as he made notes. "Your Honor," Tasha said, her voice remarkably controlled, "I would like to request a different judge hear my case, as I believe you cannot be impartial." Judge Harmon's laugh was cruel. "Of course you would. That's what you people always want, isn't it? Special treatment. Well, not in my courtroom." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. The man in the gray suit returned, this time accompanied by 2 uniformed police officers and a distinguished-looking woman in a tailored suit. They stood quietly at the back, watching. "For the record," Tasha said clearly, looking directly at the court reporter, "I am objecting to the judge's comments, which I consider racially biased and inappropriate." "Racially biased?" Judge Harmon's face turned purple with rage. How dare you play the race card in my courtroom? I've heard enough of this nonsense. He raised his gavel again, but before he could bring it down, the distinguished woman from the back of the room stepped forward. William Harmon, she called out in a clear, authoritative voice. I am Elaine Davis, Chief Justice of the State Judicial Review Board. Judge Harmon froze, his gavel suspended in midair. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. This proceeding is now suspended, Justice Davis continued, walking down the center aisle of the courtroom. Judge Harmon, you will step down from the bench immediately. The two police officers moved forward, flanking Justice Davis as she approached. What is the meaning of this? Judge Harmon sputtered, his face now alternating between red and white. You can't interrupt my court. We just did, Justice Davis replied coolly. The Judicial Review Board has received multiple complaints about your conduct, Judge Harmon. Today's display has confirmed our worst suspicions. Officer Martinez moved to stand beside Tasha, quietly offering her a chair. She sat down, her legs finally betraying the stress she had been under. This is absurd. Judge Harmon shouted. One complaint from this woman and you. One complaint. Justice Davis raised an eyebrow. No, Judge Harmon. We have 17 formal complaints filed against you in the past year alone. Ms. Johnson's treatment today is merely the final straw. The man in the gray suit stepped forward, holding up a badge. Mark Wilson, State Bureau of Investigation. We've been monitoring your courtroom for the past 3 weeks as part of an ongoing investigation into judicial misconduct. Judge Harmon's face drained of all color as he realized what was happening. His gavel finally dropped from his hand, landing on the bench with a dull thud that echoed through the silent courtroom. This is outrageous. Judge Harmon bellowed, his face flushed with anger. You cannot interrupt my courtroom. I am the law here. Justice Davis remained perfectly calm as she approached the bench. Actually, Judge Harmon, you are merely a servant of the law, not the law itself. That distinction seems to have escaped you during your time on the bench. The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone watching the extraordinary scene unfold. Tasha sat in her chair, still processing what was happening. Just minutes ago, she had been fighting a simple traffic ticket. Now she was witnessing the downfall of a powerful judge. Officer Martinez, Justice Davis called. Please escort Judge Harmon to the conference room. We need to have a private conversation before formal proceedings begin. The bailiff nodded, moving toward the bench with obvious reluctance. He had worked with Judge Harmon for years, but the things he had witnessed today crossed lines he couldn't ignore. I refuse. Judge Harmon shouted, slamming his hand on the bench. This is my courtroom. You have no authority here. Mark Wilson from the State Bureau of Investigation stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Judge Harmon, we have a warrant to search your chambers and computer records. Your authority in this courthouse has been temporarily suspended by order of the State Supreme Court. He held up an official document with clear state seals visible. Judge Harmon stared at it in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The young clerk Jason, who had been frozen in shock, finally rose from his seat. Your Honor, he said quietly, I think you should go with them. Judge Harmon's head snapped toward the clerk. You too, Turner? After everything I've done for you. Sir, Jason replied, his voice trembling slightly. What you said today, it wasn't right. And it wasn't the first time. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Justice Davis nodded to Jason, appreciation in her eyes for the young man's courage. We have reports from multiple court employees, she explained, turning to address the entire courtroom. The Judicial Review Board has been building this case for months. Today's incident was recorded not only by our investigator, but by the official court record. One of the police officers approached the court reporter. Ma'am, we'll need to secure the transcript of today's proceedings as evidence. The reporter nodded, her fingers finally stopping their frantic typing. Everything is recorded digitally as well, she offered. I can provide both versions. Judge Harmon's bluster suddenly deflated as the reality of his situation sank in. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked old and tired rather than powerful. This is because of her, isn't it? He said, pointing a trembling finger at Tasha. You're all taking her side. Tasha looked directly at the judge, her dignity intact despite everything he had put her through. "This isn't about sides, Your Honor. This is about justice." Justice Davis turned to Tasha. "Ms. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for your treatment today. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement about what occurred?" Tasha nodded slowly. "Yes, I can do that." But she hesitated, looking around the courtroom at the shocked faces. How long has this been going on? How many others has he treated this way? Mark Wilson shook his head grimly. "We've identified at least 47 cases where Judge Harmon showed clear bias against defendants of color. We believe there may be hundreds more." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Officer Martinez, who had reached the bench, now stood beside Judge Harmon with a troubled expression. "William," he said quietly, using the judge's first name for perhaps the first time in their professional relationship, "you need to step down now." Judge Harmon looked at the bailiff, betrayal written across his face. Then, with a final glare at everyone in the courtroom, he slowly removed his judicial robe. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. As he stepped down from the bench, everyone could see what he had become, not a powerful judge, but simply a bitter old man whose prejudices had finally caught up with him. The conference room door closed behind Judge Harmon, Justice Davis, and the two police officers. The remaining courtroom sat in stunned silence, the morning's events still sinking in. Tasha remained in her chair, her hands finally steady as she gathered her documents and placed them back in her folder. Mark Wilson, the State Bureau investigator, approached her with a gentle smile. "Ms. Johnson, if you be willing to come with me, we have a more comfortable room where we can take your statement." Tasha nodded, rising slowly. "Of course." She paused, looking around at the shocked faces in the gallery. "What happens to the other cases today? All these people are waiting for their hearings." Wilson's expression softened at her concern for others despite what she had just endured. "Justice Davis has arranged for Judge Karen Phillips to step in within the hour. No one will lose their day in court." As Tasha followed Wilson toward the side door, the other waiting defendants began to whisper among themselves. Some looked relieved, others confused. A few nodded respectfully to Tasha as she passed. In the hallway outside, reporters had already begun to gather. News traveled fast in the county courthouse. Wilson guided Tasha through a back corridor to avoid the press. "We've been monitoring Judge Harmon for months," Wilson explained as they walked. "But we needed clear evidence of his bias in open court. What happened today was—" He shook his head. "Well, it was exactly what we needed, but I'm sorry you had to experience it." "I'm not," Tasha said quietly. Wilson looked at her in surprise. "If it wasn't me today, it would have been someone else tomorrow," she continued. "Someone who might not have had the strength to stand up to him. Someone who might have given up on justice altogether." They reached a small meeting room where a woman was setting up recording equipment. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Miller, assigned to document victim statements in the case. "Before we begin," Wilson said, "there's something you should know, Ms. Johnson. You weren't randomly selected for traffic court today." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Your case was deliberately placed on Judge Harmon's docket. We received a tip from a courthouse employee that he had been making particularly problematic comments about African American women. We needed to document a case where his bias was clear." Tasha took a deep breath, processing this new information. "So I was bait." Detective Miller looked uncomfortable. "We prefer to think of it as creating an opportunity for documentation. But yes, in a way, we did not expect him to be so blatant. For that, we sincerely apologize." "Did you plant the traffic ticket too?" Tasha asked, her voice sharper now. Wilson shook his head quickly. "No, absolutely not. The ticket was legitimate, though our review suggests you likely would have won your case with an unbiased judge. The yellow light timing at that intersection has been problematic." Tasha sat silently for a moment, considering everything. Down the hall, raised voices could be heard from the conference room where Judge Harmon was being questioned. "What's happening to him right now?" she asked. "Justice Davis is formally notifying him of the charges," Wilson explained. "Judicial misconduct, civil rights violations, abuse of power, and potentially obstruction of justice if our investigation into his past cases reveals what we suspect it will." Detective Miller nodded solemnly. We've already uncovered evidence that he may have deliberately destroyed records of complaints against him. A loud crash echoed from down the hallway, followed by shouting. Wilson tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his phone. Is he being arrested today? Tasha asked, remarkably composed given the circumstances. That depends on how he responds to the charges, Wilson replied, distracted by the commotion, but based on what I'm hearing. The door burst open, and another officer appeared, slightly out of breath. We need you, Mark. Judge Harmon just attempted to destroy evidence in front of Justice Davis. He tried to delete files from his phone before surrendering it. Wilson stood immediately. That would be a yes, Ms. Johnson. He's definitely being arrested today. As Wilson rushed out, Detective Miller gave Tasha a grim smile. Sometimes people show exactly who they are when their power is threatened. I never doubted who he was, Tasha replied quietly. I'm just glad someone finally decided to look. The courthouse erupted into chaos. Through the thin walls of the meeting room, Tasha and Detective Miller could hear shouting, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Miller excused herself, promising to return shortly, leaving Tasha alone with her thoughts. 5 minutes passed before the door opened again. This time, it was Justice Davis who entered, her elegant suit slightly rumpled and a look of grim determination on her face. Ms. Johnson, she said, taking a seat across from Tasha, I apologize for the disturbance. Judge Harmon did not take the news of his suspension well. What happened? Tasha asked, leaning forward. Justice Davis sighed deeply. When confronted with the evidence against him, Judge Harmon attempted to delete incriminating texts and emails from his devices. When Officer Martinez tried to stop him, Harmon shoved him against the wall. Tasha's eyes widened. He assaulted a police officer. In front of witnesses? Pride comes before a fall, Justice Davis said softly, and William Harmon has had 15 years of unchecked power to feed his pride. The door opened again, and Mark Wilson reappeared, now accompanied by the young clerk, Jason Turner. The clerk looked pale and nervous, clutching a stack of folders to his chest like a shield. Ms. Johnson, Wilson said, Jason here has something important to share with you and Justice Davis. The young man stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. He began, then stopped, gathering his courage. I've been keeping records of everything. Justice Davis raised an eyebrow. Records, Mr. Turner. Jason placed the folders on the table. For the past 3 months that I've worked for Judge Harmon, I documented every inappropriate comment, every biased ruling, every time he treated someone differently based on their race, gender, or where they lived. He opened the top folder, revealing meticulously organized notes with dates, times, and detailed descriptions. I knew it was wrong, Jason continued, his voice stronger now, but I was afraid to come forward. This is my first job out of law school, and Judge Harmon has powerful friends. Tasha reached out and touched the young man's arm gently. It takes courage to do the right thing, especially when you're scared. Jason gave her a grateful look. After what I saw him do to you today, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Justice Davis was already flipping through the folders, her expression darkening with each page. This is extensive, Mr. Turner. Why didn't you bring this to the Judicial Review Board sooner? I tried, Jason admitted. I called the anonymous tip line twice, but nothing happened. I think. He hesitated, then pushed forward. I think someone was protecting him. Wilson and Justice Davis exchanged significant looks. That aligns with our suspicions, Wilson said grimly. We believe Judge Harmon has been receiving protection from someone high up in the county administration. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Through the doorway, they could see Judge Harmon being led past in handcuffs, his face contorted with rage. Gone was his judicial robe, replaced by the diminished appearance of a man whose power had been stripped away. You'll regret this, Harmon shouted, straining against his restraints. Do you know who my friends are? Do you know who I golf with every Sunday? When he spotted Tasha watching from the doorway, his face twisted even further. This is your fault. You and your kind are ruining this country. Officer Martinez firmly guided him forward. That's enough, sir. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. As Harmon was led away, still shouting threats and slurs, Justice Davis shook her head sadly. 15 years on the bench, and this is how it ends. No, Tasha said firmly. This isn't an ending. It's a beginning. For everyone who came before me and faced his prejudice without justice, this is just the beginning. Jason Turner nodded, determination replacing the fear on his young face. And I'm ready to testify about everything I've seen. Wilson closed the door, shutting out the noise from the hallway. Well then, he said, let's get to work. Judge Harmon's day in court is coming, but this time you'll be the one facing judgment. The news of Judge William Harmon's arrest spread through the county like wildfire. By evening, it was the lead story on every local news channel. The courthouse steps became a gathering place for reporters, their camera lights illuminating the historic building well into the night. 3 days after the incident, Tasha sat in her living room, staring at the television in disbelief. The news anchor's voice filled the quiet space. More developments today in the shocking case of former Judge William Harmon. At least 37 people have now come forward with similar stories of discrimination and abuse of power in his courtroom. The State Bureau of Investigation has confirmed they are reviewing over 300 cases presided over by Harmon during his 15-year tenure. Tasha's phone rang for what seemed like the 100th time that day. This time she answered. Ms. Johnson, this is Patricia Walker from the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund. We've been following your case, and we'd like to offer our support. Tasha sighed, rubbing her temple. I appreciate that, Ms. Walker, but I've already spoken with several organizations. I'm not sure I want to be the face of this case. I understand, Patricia replied gently, but this isn't just about Judge Harmon anymore. This case has exposed systemic problems in the county's judicial system. People are listening now in a way they haven't before. Outside Tasha's window, a car pulled up. Her sister Keisha had arrived, bringing dinner and moral support. Tasha had barely left her house since the incident, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Can I think about it? Tasha asked. Of course, but remember, your voice matters. What happened to you in that courtroom has happened to countless others who never got justice. After hanging up, Tasha opened the door for her sister, who entered carrying bags of food and a determined expression. I saw Jason Turner on the news today, Keisha announced, setting the food on the coffee table. That young clerk? He's become quite the whistleblower. Tasha nodded. He's brave. His career could have been ruined. Speaking of careers, Keisha said, unpacking containers of food, have you checked your email? The community center board wants to talk to you. About what? They're forming a citizens committee to review judicial appointments in the county. They want you to lead it. Tasha paused, a fork halfway to her mouth. Me? Why me? I'm a social worker, not a legal expert. Because you stood up to him, Tash. You didn't back down when he tried to humiliate you. People respect that. As they ate, more news about the case flashed across the TV screen. Images showed protesters gathered outside the county administration building, holding signs demanding a full investigation of the court system. It's bigger than just Harmon now, Keisha commented. They're looking into 3 other judges with similar complaints, and that clerk's records. They implicate the county commissioner too. Apparently, he helped bury complaints about Harmon for years. Tasha's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mark Wilson. Meeting tomorrow at 10. More victims want to come forward. They're asking for you. I never wanted any of this, Tasha said quietly. I just wanted to fight a traffic ticket. Keisha took her sister's hand. Sometimes we don't choose our battles, sis. Sometimes they choose us. Later that evening, after Keisha had gone, Tasha stood at her window looking out at the quiet street. Her neighborhood, the same one Judge Harmon had mocked, was peaceful in the evening light. Children rode bikes along the sidewalk. An elderly couple walked hand in hand. A young man helped his grandmother carry groceries from the car. This was her community. These were the people who had been silently suffering under biased judges and an unfair system for years. Tasha made her decision. She picked up her phone and called Patricia Walker back. Ms. Walker, this is Tasha Johnson. I've been thinking about what you said. If my voice can help make real change happen, then I'm ready to speak. On the other side of town, in a holding cell, former Judge William Harmon sat alone, his power and privilege stripped away. The system he had abused for so long was now being used to hold him accountable. Justice, though delayed, was finally being served. 6 months passed since that fateful day in courtroom 302. The county courthouse looked the same from the outside, an imposing stone building with tall columns and broad steps. But inside, everything had changed. Tasha Johnson walked up those steps on a bright spring morning, no longer nervous or uncertain. People nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even stopped to shake her hand. Today was the final day of William Harmon's trial, and everyone expected the jury to return with a verdict. "Ms. Johnson," called a familiar voice. Jason Turner hurried toward her, dressed in a sharp suit, looking more confident than the frightened clerk she had met half a year ago. "They're about to reconvene. We should get inside." Together they entered the courtroom, not 302, but the larger courtroom 101, where major trials were held. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. In the front row, Mark Wilson and Justice Davis saved a place for Tasha. "Nervous?" Wilson asked as she sat down. "No," Tasha replied truthfully. "Whatever happens today, we've already won the bigger battle." And they had. In the months following Harmon's arrest, the investigation had expanded far beyond one biased judge. The county commissioner had resigned in disgrace when Jason's records revealed his role in covering up complaints. 2 other judges had been removed from the bench. The entire court system was being reformed under the watchful eye of a newly established Citizens Judicial Oversight Committee, which Tasha now co-chaired. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Karen Phillips entered. Phillips, a respected jurist known for her fairness, had been appointed to oversee Harmon's trial to ensure complete impartiality. "Be seated," Judge Phillips said. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a middle-aged plumber, stood. "We have, Your Honor." A hush fell over the courtroom. At the defense table, William Harmon sat stiffly in his expensive suit, the months of stress visible on his face. His powerful friends had abandoned him one by one as more victims came forward. "On the first count, judicial misconduct, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the second count, civil rights violations, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the third count, obstruction of justice, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Each pronouncement was met with complete silence, the weight of the moment holding everyone still. When all 7 counts had been read, all with the same verdict, Judge Phillips thanked the jury for their service. "William Harmon, please rise for sentencing." As Harmon stood, his eyes briefly met Tasha's across the courtroom. There was no longer any arrogance there, only defeat. "William Harmon, you have betrayed the sacred trust placed in you as a judge. You used your position not to uphold justice but to inflict your personal prejudices on those who came before you seeking fairness." Judge Phillips continued, her voice firm. "I sentence you to 5 years in prison and permanent disbarment. You will never again hold any position of public trust." Outside the courthouse after the proceedings, reporters swarmed around Tasha, shouting questions. She answered a few before raising her hands for quiet. "Today isn't about revenge," she told the assembled crowd. "It's about accountability. No one is above the law, especially those entrusted to enforce it." A reporter called out, "Ms. Johnson, what about your traffic ticket? The one that started all this?" Tasha laughed. The genuine, warm sound. "Dismissed. The light was indeed yellow, just as I said." Later that evening, Tasha sat on her porch with Keisha, watching the neighborhood children play. A community newsletter lay on the table between them, featuring an article about the newly diverse judges now serving in the county courts. "You know," Keisha said, "when you left for court that morning, fighting a simple traffic ticket, I never imagined where it would lead." Tasha smiled, watching the sunset paint her neighborhood in golden light. "Neither did I, but sometimes justice needs a spark to light the way." Across town, in a prison cell, former Judge William Harmon faced the first night of his sentence, learning what so many who had stood before him had learned: that true justice comes not from power, but from truth, fairness, and courage. The courage Tasha Johnson had shown on that ordinary morning in courtroom 302.